Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We've still got a few people arriving, so we might just wait a couple of minutes before we start the main content of the webinar, so just bear with us. Okay, well, we might make a start. People are still arriving, but the session will be recorded. So all being well, that will mean that everyone who wants to get all of the content can download it later and listen. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining either live or connecting via recording after the event. In either case, I'm grateful for your time. My name is Andrew Jones. I'm one of the members of the BDO Food and Agribusiness team and a corporate and international tax partner here with BDO in Brisbane. So the 2021-22 federal budget, what's in it for ag? That's the content that I'll be discussing in this webinar. And I think that just to start with, to set the scene, the federal government's vision is to grow Australia's agriculture industry to $100 billion in value by 2030. So that's the Ag 2030 strategy, which has been in place for a couple of years now. And it was interesting that for the 2021 financial year, the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment expects that the industry will be valued over 71 billion for this financial year. So it's one of the only industries to have grown in value despite the challenges associated with COVID-19. And that's well on the way towards that $100 billion target. And then when we consider that over 330,000 people are employed across Australia in agriculture, and in food and beverage manufacturing, there's another effectively 250,000 people almost employed. The whole Australian agricultural supply chain supports 1.6 million people and regional communities. So I think it goes without saying that the economic significance of agriculture to Australia can't be understated. So in terms of this budget, the expenditure measures that really affect or benefit agriculture are not of the same scale and structural nature as expenditures on, for example, aged care reform. However, the budget does have a range of programs, either newly funded or provided with additional funding, which will benefit ag and regional communities. Various commentators have speculated about whether the budget is an election budget, so-called, with its significant expenditures and lack of additional revenue measures. Whether or not this is the case, I think will remain to be seen. However, I believe that it's an expansionary budget. It's intended not just to prime the pump, but effectively to throw the old pump out and install a much larger one in its place. So in this webinar, I will begin by discussing some of the very few tax changes contained in the budget. As a tax partner, that's obviously something that I'm interested in. I'll then run through the programs that are funded in the budget that relate to agriculture and agribusiness, including the Northern Australia strategy, measures related to biosecurity, some welcome expenditures on soil and water, touch briefly on drought, trade, the digital strategy and regional programs. So quite a lot to get through. I'll start with personal taxes. And these will really be relevant for individuals in agribusinesses who are like employees or who conduct business in their own name. So the government announced it will continue with the tax rate cuts which were planned last budget. They've also announced that they'll extend the low and middle income tax offset for the 2021-22 income year. That offset was originally available for 2019, 2020 and the 2021 financial years. So they're pushing that out for another year. So in that sense, it's not really a tax cut as such, it's just a continuation of an offset program. It depends on the individual's taxable incomes in terms of the value of that offset, but it's targeted at low and middle income earners, and it maxes out at $1,080 for a taxpayer. And that's received when the taxpayer lodges their tax return, either as a reduction in the tax payable or as an increase in the refund that they would get. The other, I think, measure to flag with in relation to individuals are changes to superannuation. The government has proposed removing the $450 per month minimum income threshold that determines whether employees must pay, whether the employers must pay the superannuation guarantee in respect of their employees. This will benefit low income earners, and I think ostensibly it progresses superannuation equality for all, but administratively we think that it will create quite a burden on employers. It can't really be understated. Once the measure is implemented, employers will need to ensure that they have an appropriate and up-to-date payroll system in place to track and capture, in particular, any casual working arrangements. So moving on now to some of, I think, more substantial budget measures. The temporary full expensing of capital assets has been extended by 12 months. Now, those measures were originally announced in the last federal budget as part of the government's COVID response. And I think, as most would be aware, they broaden the ability for businesses to immediately deduct the cost of new and in many cases, second-hand assets. So for agriculture, it's important to remember that these temporary full expensing measures don't apply to primary production assets where you get a deduction under some of the concessional primary production asset deductions regarding water assets, fencing, fodder storage, horticultural plants. For all other assets, including equipment and capital improvements on primary production land, the full expensing is valuable. So in summary, businesses with an aggregated annual turnover of less than $5 billion will continue to be entitled to an immediate tax deduction for the full cost of new eligible capital assets and improvements to existing eligible assets that were acquired basically from the announcement of the measure, which was the 6th of October 2020, and they need to be first used or installed for use by 30 June 2023. So that was 30 June 2022. As I said, second-hand assets as well, if are able to be equally deducted the cost in full for businesses with an aggregated turnover of less than $50 million. Again, the assets need to be installed ready for use by 30 June 2023. There is an alternative test, I guess, for businesses that companies which have turnover in excess of $5 billion, and that broadly requires a certain threshold expenditure of depreciating assets exceeding $100 million. So I think this extension is valuable. Anecdotally, we're aware of businesses that are facing long lead times on the delivery of new equipment. So I think the 12 months extension will allow businesses to make further investments with confidence, particularly where we have longer planning, procurement or construction timeframes. I think that the COVID-19 recovery as well, driven by business investment in capital expenditure, will be powerful. I think our view really continues to be that more generous and broadly available immediate asset write-off measures should be formalised as part of the law as a permanent feature rather than the ongoing temporary nature of these measures, which we've seen over quite a number of years. So bear in mind that in the law there is an immediate asset write-off for small businesses for assets costing up to about $1,000. So having a more generous and broadly available deduction for the full cost of assets would be a welcome amendment. The government in the budget has also announced an extension to the temporary loss carryback rules that were sort of reintroduced in the 2020 federal budget. So prior to the reintroduction of these measures, a company could only carry a tax loss that it made, carry it forward and apply that tax loss against taxable income of a future year. So broadly, it had to wait until it returned to profitability before it could utilise a tax loss. So by contrast, the loss carryback rules broadly allow companies to utilise losses to recoup tax previously paid on profits of earlier years. So again, these measures are temporary in nature at the present time. There was an agenda several years ago for loss carryback to be a permanent feature of the law, but it was removed from the law for various reasons. They're temporary. They'll apply now for an extra 12 months in terms of the ability to recoup losses back against profits from the 2019 income year. So in our view, the loss carryback can significantly benefit primary production companies who deal with fluctuations in taxable income due to external factors such as seasons or markets. We continue to advocate for making the loss carryback a permanent feature of the law. And in particular, as I said, we believe that it would benefit primary producers structured as companies. The government has also announced that it will allow businesses to self-assess the tax effective lives of intangible depreciating assets, such as patents, registered designs, and copyrights. I think this announcement has gathered a fair bit of attention, but it's important to note that trademarks, know-how, recipes, plant breeders' rights, goodwill, confidential information, and the like are not depreciable, so the proposed measures don't apply to them. However, in terms of the measure that was announced, currently for tax purposes, depreciable intangible assets which have a statutory effective tax life, the measures will mean that the taxpayers will be able to self-assess that effective life, so they won't be bound by the statutory rate. They'll be better able to align the economic life of the asset, the effective life of the asset, I should say, with its economic life. The measure will apply to assets acquired from 1 July 2023 after the temporary full expensing regime has concluded, and assuming that the government doesn't choose to extend that regime again. BDO welcomes the change to the law, the proposed change to the law. We believe that the amendment recognises the rapid innovation currently occurring globally. It'll better equip businesses to be agile and explore innovative and entrepreneurial investment opportunities. I think in terms of the measures in the budget that verge on genuine tax reform, one of the most interesting initiatives was the proposal to implement a patent box regime. Now, this isn't directly relevant for agriculture or agribusiness. In its initial announcement, it only applies to medical and biotechnology companies or innovations. However, we believe that the proposal is probably a sign of things to come, and it may be, we hope, expanded more broadly to be industry agnostic, as is the case in other countries. So I thought it would be worthwhile just briefly discussing that proposal in this presentation. And in broad terms, a patent box regime provides a concessional tax rate on income derived from patents that are held by taxpayers in a country. So the government's purpose with this regime is really to incentivise Australian businesses to keep the ownership and commercialisation of intellectual property in Australia. Income on such intellectual property will be taxed under this proposal at 17%. Income from manufacturing, branding, other attributes will still be taxed at the relevant corporate tax rate, likely up to 30%. It's important to note that the government has signalled that the design of the patent box regime is still ongoing, and they intend to consult with industry. So we'll continue to monitor the situation, but as I say, in due course, our hope is that is expanded out to the economy more broadly. In terms of investment structures, the government has announced that the commencement of the proposed corporate collective investment vehicle measures, which were first announced in the 2019 federal budget, will be deferred to 1 July 2022. Now, this structure is an investment vehicle that provides flow-through tax treatment, but appears as a company. It's intended, because it's a feature of other jurisdictions, it's intended to provide international investors with a familiar vehicle to structure their Australian investments through. So we understand that the government is consulting broadly in terms of the design of that, and the start date now has been pushed back, as I say, to 1 July 2022. Finally, and while it's not a tax measure as such, I noted that in this budget, the government has announced that it will waive farm business income reconciliation debts relating to payments under the farm household allowance, payments up to and including those in the 2020 financial year. So I'll now move on to discussing other expenditure measures, starting with the next 5-year plan for Northern Australia. So in this budget, the government has committed approximately $190 million to its next 5-year plan for the development of Northern Australia. This will fund measures to be rolled out from 2021 through 2026. And the government says that the investment will support jobs growth and economic resilience with investment in geographic regions of growth, initiatives that enable greater digital connectivity in Northern Australia, and business support grants to scale up and diversify operations. The focus will be on local sectoral strengths, delivering the government's JobMaker plan, digital business plan, gas-fired recovery, the Ag 2030 strategy, and the modern manufacturing strategy. So over the 5-year period, the government will invest $112 million in the Northern Australia Development Program, which will provide co-investment grants to help businesses to scale and diversify. A further $68.5 million will be invested in telecommunications projects to help improve digital connectivity in northern regions. And the remaining funds, roughly $9 million, will be invested in the Regions of Growth pilot program. As part of that pilot program, the government will provide locally based support to help communities identify and capitalise on their strengths. And the Regions of Growth to be piloted in the first stage: Mount Isa to Townsville, Cairns to Gladstone, the Beetaloo Basin to Darwin Port, and Broome to Kununurra to Darwin, with the focus on areas such as advanced manufacturing, critical minerals development, and agriculture. So we look forward to seeing the detailed Our Future 2021-26 plan when it is released in the coming months. In other measures, there's over $400 million in this budget of new funding for investment into biosecurity measures. And the Prime Minister announced these measures at Beef Australia, Beef Week recently. The investments are broad, include new technology and screening processes, which appear primarily targeted at stopping the infiltration of African swine fever, but will have benefits for detecting other risks. There's investments in people and offshore screening, advertising and awareness campaigns, and technology-based solutions to improve the speed and accuracy of pest and disease identification at the border. The Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment states that not only will these measures protect the value of Australian agriculture, and they specifically flag the more than 4.9 million pigs produced annually in Australia, but the measures will also continue to give our trading partners confidence that Australian exports meet their biosecurity requirements. So that's quite an important feature of these biosecurity measures. So we welcome the government's investment into these programs, and I find it particularly pleasing that this is a new funding commitment rather than a diversion of funding from existing programs. And ideally, the funding is maintained and ideally enhanced in future years. I'll now move on to cover some of the measures that regard soil and water, and briefly touch on drought also. So starting with soil, as attendees would no doubt be aware, the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment has been consulting on the development of a national soil strategy and an associated action plan. So the draft national soil strategy was published earlier this year. And in that document, I found it particularly insightful But Soil Science Australia estimated that Australia's soil provides an estimated value of roughly $930 billion per year, which is an astronomical value to the country. It includes the value of ecosystem services provided by the soil, but even on economic terms, based on agricultural production, Australia's soil is estimated to contribute $63 billion per year to the economy. So really substantial values. And in my view, they entirely justify the admittedly slim expenditures in this budget, specifically on soil. So what are they? There's about $6 million over the forward estimates to implement and support the National Soil Strategy. But the key feature, I think, is, and again, hopefully a sign of even bigger things to come, there's $190 million in new funding, which will be allocated to projects linked to the Soil Action Plan, substantially a 2-year National Soil Monitoring and Incentives pilot program, which, among other things, will provide payments to farmers and land managers to capture existing soil data and report it back to the program. The pilot program also aims to vastly improve the quality and extent of the available data on Australian soils, along with redeveloping data reporting and access points. So the critical importance of soil quality and longevity continues to gain global momentum, and I think that's quite apart from any kind of role that we will see soil take in terms of carbon sequestration. So the funding provided in this budget, although it is very small, is a welcome step in the right direction. In terms of water, there's $1.5 billion which will be provided over the forward estimates for a package relating to the Murray-Darling Basin, including modernisation of irrigation infrastructure, grants for water-saving projects, and to develop a water market reform agenda in that region. Those grants, I understand, will be substantially delivered by the various state governments in those basin catchments and communities. Additionally, the on-farm emergency water infrastructure rebate scheme has been extended by 12 months, and it will now end on 30 June 2022. I'm sorry. That was expected to end a couple of years ago, but it still continues to be overwhelmingly popular. So the budget continues to allocate funding to the program, and it's worth noting that South Australia and Western Australia and New South Wales also provide co-contributions to eligible participants. The scheme assists drought-affected primary producers and horticulture operators to buy and install on-farm water infrastructure. So we would encourage other state and territory governments to implement co-contribution arrangements also. In other water measures, about $100 million will be withdrawn from the National Water Grid Fund for various projects, including contributions to the Werribee Irrigation District Modernisation Project in Victoria, a small amount for the Rookwood Weir in Queensland, and a variety of other storage and pipeline projects across the country. And finally, the National Water Grid Connections Program is a new funding pathway, which is also funded from the National Water Grid Fund to provide $160 million over 2 years to deliver small-scale water infrastructure projects and provide short-term economic stimulus. Again, it will be developed and rolled out in conjunction with agencies, it says, and we'll await the details of those delivery agencies and the assessment criteria in due course. Touching briefly on drought, there are a number of programs which have been on foot now for a couple of years, and the budget continues to allocate further funding to them, including those that were announced in the last federal budget. Turning briefly to trade, no significant agriculture trade funding to report, but we will get an international agriculture envoy who will represent Australian agricultural exports to new markets and enhance Australia's participation in international agriculture and food standards organisations. So that will be an interesting development to monitor and see the success of. In addition to the trade benefits, which I flagged earlier from the biosecurity investment measures, the budget will also allocate an additional $37 million to developing the simplified trade platform, which was announced in the 2020-2021 federal budget, so the last federal budget. So I guess it's not new funding, but there's a further $73 million over 3 years, which will be allocated to support food and agriculture exporters to maintain, diversify or expand their export markets through the Agribusiness Expansion Initiative. So I'll now move on to talking about the digital economy strategy, which has some interesting relevance, I think, for agriculture and more particularly regional communities, and perhaps not intuitively digital in its nature. As part of the strategy, the government has committed roughly $32.5 million over 2 years for what they call the Emerging Aviation Technology Partnerships Program, which will support the use of emerging aviation technologies to address priority community mobility and cargo needs in regional Australia. So using these funds, the government will collaborate with industry to support the introduction of aviation technology, including electric engines, drones, electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. And the intention from these partnerships includes growing manufacturing jobs, connecting regional communities, digital farming, boosting regional supply chains, and improving health outcomes for remote Indigenous communities. So I think quite an interesting development in funding these programs, and we'll watch to see what benefits these bring to regional communities, and particularly in terms of connecting communities together and enabling digital farming. It seems quite promising. The government's also committed $12 million, which is admittedly not a significant amount of money in the scheme of things, over 5 years to catalyse artificial intelligence opportunities in regional areas. So they'll fund up to 36 competitive grants to develop artificial intelligence solutions to address local or regional problems. There is a broader artificial intelligence suite in the digital economy measures, but not necessarily specifically targeted at regional areas. However, for this particular program, it's intended that it will build greater awareness of the benefits of artificial intelligence in regional communities. We expect to see 3 grant rounds with 12 per round, and eligible applications will be universities, research bodies, technology companies, and regional businesses, including SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, and startups. So quite a wide range of applicants. I suggest that the funding may benefit primary producers looking at customised or sophisticated ag tech solutions, although I do note that a lot of off-the-shelf ag tech solutions these days do feature some degree of artificial intelligence in the insights that they gather. So for those interested, this will be a grant round to watch. As part of the digital economy strategy, there's a further $40 million allocated to creating a 3-dimensional digital atlas of Australia's geography. So the data content of this atlas will gather a diverse range of geographical information systems and the like, and put them together in an easily accessible digital format that may be of interest to agribusinesses, particularly if the data sets also include soil and rainfall data, as I believe that it's reasonable to presume that they should. So we'll continue to watch the development in that space. And I think as a comment, digital and agriculture is only continuing to gain momentum. So programs like these will really enable that transformation to continue in this sector. From a regional perspective, more broadly, ongoing farm worker shortages continue to be widely publicised. So again, in this budget, the federal government has tried to stimulate more workers in regional workforces, particularly regarding temporary visa holders. So student visas will now be able to work more than 40 hours per fortnight if they're employed in the agriculture sector, and as well tourism and hospitality. This is, I think, building off the similar measure which was implemented through COVID to permit such students to work in the health and aged care sectors. Certain temporary visa holders will also not need to demonstrate their attempts to depart if they intend to undertake agricultural work. So some incentives there for people who would otherwise not be able to work to participate in agricultural work. There's a further $1.6 million which has been allocated to the program to assist job seekers who relocate to take up agricultural work. They've also adjusted the eligibility for that program. I think the minimum age level has been decreased slightly. When this relocation program was introduced, I think it's a step in the right direction. I'm not sure that the take up has been exactly where the government would like to have seen it, but nevertheless, actions are being taken to try and encourage people to relocate to regions to take up ag work. So we'll continue to wait and see how that plays out. Otherwise, with regard to regional funding, there's a further round of the Building Better Regions Fund, so up to round 6 now. Really seeing the benefits of this program in various regional centres with urban renewal and the like. So $265.5 million for round 6 to build community infrastructure and capacity in regional areas. And there's a further nearly $85 million allocated to the Regional Connectivity Program to support the delivery of reliable, affordable and innovative digital services and technologies in Australia. Interestingly enough, I noticed that $600,000 is earmarked to be spent in 2022 financial year to undertake a scoping study into establishing Australian public service hubs in regional Australia. So it seems like that's still on the agenda for the government, and they're interested in understanding more about the opportunities that might exist in that space. So we may see some further announcements or intentions from various departments beyond 2022 in this regard. So I think in terms of wrapping up these comments prior to moving on to taking any questions, it can be tough to make predictions about the future. And this is especially true, I think, when considering the agricultural sector, with seasonal variability and commodity market volatility, not to mention rapid geopolitical developments that threaten our exports. So it's encouraging to see the government making sensible investments in fundamentals that will benefit agribusiness. That said, I think in the scheme of things, spending on agribusiness measures is relatively minor when compared with other budget spending. And given the economic significance of agriculture and the valuable contribution of agriculture assets, including soils, I would encourage a greater investment in direct expenditure measures to benefit ag. Unfortunately, as well, at least from my professional perspective, there's a distinct lack of interest in structural tax reform from this government at the present time. Spending does seem to be the priority, with little commentary on how the revenue is going to be raised to pay for that. Certainly yesterday also, some comments yesterday from the Secretary of the Treasury that some may be aware of indicate a preference, at least from the Treasury Department, for a medium-term expenditure cut rather than tax changes or even increases. So we'll wait to see how that plays out. No doubt the government is hoping that growth in the economy will come from the expenditures in the current and potentially future budgets, such that in the medium term, those expenditure cuts can sort of sustain themselves through the growth that occurs in the economy. So I think whilst the soaring iron ore price and potentially large farm incomes might be increasing the expected tax revenue beyond what was originally forecast last budget, BDO nevertheless strongly advocates for a considered structural tax reform. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. We'll welcome any comments or questions. I see there's a couple that have come through on the chat. After the webinar, we'll also ask for your feedback and opinions on a couple of points, so I'd really appreciate your time in responding to those. So any info, one question that's come through is about what the simplified trade platform funding is currently looking like and what that may mean for exporters. So in terms of my personal experience, I don't have insights into the development of the simplified trade platform, but from a conceptual level, the intention there was to streamline export certificates into various markets. So I understand that there was a substantial number of diverse platforms that exporters had to apply to get certification to go into specific overseas markets. And the simplified trade platform is intended to streamline that process. So anecdotally, it will benefit the export of agricultural products, but as I say, I don't personally have a huge amount of experience using that platform. I think, though, in general terms, it's worthwhile noting that any expenditures that streamline the ability for Australian produce to leave Australian markets is good expenditure. I think the government in the Ag 2030 strategy acknowledges that to grow to $100 billion in revenue, we have to substantially develop Australian agricultural export markets. So structural platforms that permit that will be valuable. So it doesn't look like there's any additional queries that have come through. I'm more than happy to discuss any points or to speak with anyone after the event. My details will be sent through. So again, thank you very much for your time and attention. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us today, and we'll wrap up our webinar here. Thanks.